It was late December last year when my friends and I decided to stay at a remote cabin in the Rockies. The plan was simple: disconnect from the noise of everyday life and have a little adventure. It wasn't our first camping trip, but it would certainly be the most memorable. The cabin came to us through Jack, a friend of mine who'd heard about it from a coworker. The coworker had mentioned it almost as a dare, spinning tales of strange events and an ominous locked door in the cabin. Supposedly, the cabin had once belonged to a man from Arizona or Utah who rented it out occasionally before disappearing under mysterious circumstances. The stories attached to the place ranged from bizarre to outright terrifying. People spoke of strange lights, unexplained sounds, and even missing hikers in the area. The locked door was the centerpiece of every story. Guests who stayed there reported hearing noises behind it: footsteps, whispers, the creak of furniture being moved. Some swore it opened on its own when they were out hiking, only to be inexplicably locked again upon their return. The coworker, however, warned Jack, "Don't try to open that door. It's locked for a reason." Naturally, we ignored that advice. There were 4 of us on the trip: Jack, his girlfriend Laura, our mutual friend Eric, and me. We left Denver early, hoping to make it to the trailhead before the winter sun dipped too low. The drive to the Route National Forest was uneventful. Snow blanketed the ground, and the air had that sharp, crisp quality that only winter brings. Jack had a handwritten map from his coworker with directions to the cabin. The nearest road was miles away, so we parked the car at the base of the trail and hiked in. It was a 3-hour trek through the trees, our boots crunching through patches of snow. As we walked, the forest grew darker and denser, swallowing what little daylight remained. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep indigo. The cabin was in worse shape than we'd imagined. The roof sagged, half covered in snow, and the wood siding was weathered and cracked. It sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, isolated and eerily quiet. A narrow path of dirt led up to the front door, which hung slightly ajar, creaking in the faint breeze. We hesitated briefly before stepping inside. The interior was just as run down. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and rotting wood. A fireplace sat in one corner, its stone facade blackened from years of use. The furniture, what little was left, was covered in a thick layer of dust. But it wasn't the state of the cabin that unsettled me. It was the silence.
No birds.
No wind. Not even the faint hum of insects. And then there was the door. Tucked into the far wall, partially obscured by shadows, was the infamous locked door. It was solid wood, its surface scarred with deep gouges as if someone, or something, had tried to claw their way through. A heavy, rusted padlock secured it shut. I felt a chill, but whether it was from the cold or unease, I couldn't tell. We set up camp inside, rolling out sleeping bags and unpacking snacks. The plan was simple: light a fire, tell some ghost stories, and maybe mess around with a Ouija board Eric had brought. We were all skeptics to varying degrees, but the idea of contacting spirits added a thrill to the night. As the hours passed, we relaxed. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Jack, ever the joker, kept making dramatic gestures toward the locked door, daring it to do something. Laura rolled her eyes and Eric laughed nervously, but none of us really believed anything would happen. Until it did. It started subtly, a faint knocking sound, so quiet we almost didn't notice it. We all paused, glancing at each other to confirm we weren't imagining things. The sound came again, louder this time. It was rhythmic, deliberate, coming from the locked door. "Probably just the wind," Jack said, his voice tight, but the firelight betrayed his unease. The knocking stopped, replaced by a faint scratching noise. It was as if something was trying to dig its way out. Eric stood, moving closer to the door. "Maybe it's an animal," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. He leaned in, pressing his ear against the wood. Suddenly, he stumbled back, his face pale. Something whispered. What did it say? Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Eric replied. It didn't sound like words, just noise. We decided to leave the cabin, but as we packed up, the scratching grew louder, more insistent, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. We froze, waiting for something, anything to happen. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, with a deafening crash, the padlock shattered, and the door swung open. The room beyond was pitch black, an abyss that seemed to swallow the light from our flashlights. The air grew colder, and an overpowering smell of decay wafted out. Jack, always the brave one, stepped closer. Stay back, he said, his voice trembling. I'll check it out. Before we could stop him, he crossed the threshold. He disappeared into the darkness, his flashlight beam cutting through the void. Seconds passed, then minutes. Jack, Laura called out, panic rising in her voice. There was no response. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed from the room. Jack stumbled back out, his face pale and twisted in terror. We need to go. Now. We didn't ask questions. Grabbing our gear, we bolted from the cabin, running blindly into the forest. The trees loomed around us, their shadows stretching like grasping hands. Behind us, the cabin seemed to glow faintly, an unnatural light spilling from the open door. Jack wouldn't talk about what he'd seen, and we didn't press him. But as we reached the car and sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped unscathed. In the weeks that followed, strange things began to happen. Jack started having vivid nightmares, waking up screaming about the door. Laura claimed she heard faint knocking sounds at night, even though she lived in an apartment building. Eric moved out of state, cutting contact with all of us. And me, I started noticing scratches on my bedroom walls. Deep, jagged marks that hadn't been there before. It's been almost a year now. I haven't spoken to Jack or Laura since. But every now and then, I hear faint knocking sounds, always coming from behind a locked door. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, a break from the stress of work and endless city noise. My friends and I, a group of 5, had planned to camp deep in the wilderness of northern Montana, far from the distractions of the modern world. The plan was simple: hike during the day, set up camp at night, and just enjoy the peace that only isolation can bring. It sounded perfect, until it wasn't. We arrived at the trailhead early on a crisp autumn morning, backpacks heavy with supplies and spirits high. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of pine, and the sound of birds chirping overhead gave us a false sense of serenity. By late afternoon, we had ventured far off the beaten path, pushing deeper into the forest than we had originally planned. We wanted to find a spot untouched by other campers, somewhere we could feel completely alone. That's when we found the cabin. It was nestled among the trees, almost hidden by the overgrown brush and creeping ivy that had taken over the structure. At first glance, it looked abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the wooden walls weathered and cracked. It had no visible path leading to it, just a clearing that seemed too unnatural to be random. Despite the eerie vibe, we were intrigued. It looked like something out of a horror movie, but we were a group of young adults who thought we were invincible. So instead of turning away, we decided it would be our base for the night. The first red flag should have been the door. It wasn't locked, but it was heavy, as if something on the other side was resisting our push. The inside was dark, with a musty smell that made us cough as soon as we stepped in. Dust clung to every surface, and the floor creaked under our weight. The cabin had 2 small rooms, one with a makeshift kitchen and an old wooden table, and another that looked like it had been used as a sleeping area, with a single broken cot in the corner. We ignored the obvious signs that this place wasn't meant to be lived in. Instead, we told ourselves it was just old, a relic from the past, maybe a hunting cabin left to rot. None of us mentioned the strange carvings etched into the walls. They were crude, like someone had scratched them into the wood with a knife or their bare nails. Shapes, lines, and symbols that didn't make sense. One of my friends joked about how it was just graffiti from the old days, and we laughed it off. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the symbols weren't random. They looked deliberate, like they meant something. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we built a fire outside the cabin. The warmth and light of the flames made the unease I felt inside the cabin fade, and we started to relax. We told stories, laughed, and shared drinks, the way we always did on trips like this. For a while, it felt normal. But then the wind picked up, and the forest around us seemed to go silent. The laughter died down, and an uncomfortable stillness settled over us. That's when we heard it, a faint whispering, so soft it was almost drowned out by the crackling of the fire. At first, we thought it was the wind, but it didn't sound like rustling leaves or the groan of branches. It sounded like voices, low and unintelligible. We all froze, straining to listen, but as soon as the whispers started, they stopped. Someone made a joke about how the woods were messing with our heads, and we all laughed nervously. But the mood had shifted. We decided to head inside the cabin, thinking it would feel safer. Didn't. The moment we stepped through the door, the air felt heavier, colder. The firelight outside barely penetrated the dusty windows, and the cabin seemed darker than it should have been. I couldn't help but notice how the shadows from our flashlights seemed to stretch longer than they should, pooling in the corners like something was lurking there. We huddled together in the main room, trying to shake off the unease. But then things started happening that we couldn't explain. One of the chairs by the table tipped over on its own. We told ourselves it was the uneven floor, even though it had been still for hours. A small pile of dust fell from the ceiling, but when we looked up, there was no crack, no reason for it. The whispers came back, louder this time, but still impossible to understand. It was as if they were coming from the walls themselves. The temperature inside the cabin kept dropping. We could see our breath now, even though the fire outside should have kept the cabin warm. One of my friends suggested we leave, but it was pitch black outside, and the thought of navigating the forest in the dark seemed more dangerous than staying put. So we stayed, each of us pretending we weren't scared. When morning finally came, we were eager to leave. The unease from the night before had solidified into dread. As we stepped outside, we noticed something that hadn't been there the night before. A perfect ring of scorched earth surrounded the cabin. The grass and leaves blackened as if burned. There was no sign of fire, no smell of smoke. Just a dead, blackened circle that seemed to mark the cabin like a warning. We didn't talk much as we packed up and left. The hike back to the trailhead was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. No one wanted to admit how scared they had been or try to make sense of what had happened. That cabin stayed with me, though. I've spent years trying to rationalize what we experienced, telling myself it was just our minds playing tricks on us. But deep down, I know something was wrong with that place. It wasn't ghosts or monsters, nothing you'd see in a movie. It was just a feeling, a presence, something that made you feel like you weren't supposed to be there, like you were trespassing on something ancient and unknowable. I haven't been camping since, and I never will. When I was scared as a kid, my dad used to tell me not to be afraid of ghosts. Fear the living, he would say, because they can actually hurt you. Those words stuck with me. I used to roll my eyes at him, thinking it was just another one of his cautionary lessons. But after what happened at the cabin, I can't hear that phrase without a chill running down my spine. It was the winter of 2007, and I was 19 years old. My dad had died earlier that year, leaving behind an unexpected inheritance. He'd taken his own life, a shock I wasn't ready for, and with it came a mix of grief, anger, and confusion. Among the things he left behind was a cabin in a remote area near the base of Mount Rainier in Washington state. The cabin was in the process of being sold because my mom couldn't keep up with the costs. The paperwork wasn't finalized yet, and the place was going to sit empty for a month. I figured it was the perfect time to get away, clear my head, and try to make sense of my life. I packed up my dad's old truck, which he'd also left to me, grabbed my dog, Rocky, and loaded up with supplies. I decided to spend about a week up there. I didn't even bother telling the rental management company. I had the keys, the alarm code, and a desperate need for solitude. The cabin was a simple two-story structure. The lower floor had a cozy living room, a guest bedroom, and a tiny kitchen. Upstairs was the master bedroom with a balcony and another small, unused room. The surrounding area was dense with tall evergreens, the kind that seemed to stretch forever into the sky. There were only 2 other cabins nearby, both about a block away, but I hadn't seen any signs of life there in the first 2 days. The first couple of days were uneventful. I spent my time playing with Rocky in the snow, watching DVDs, and playing video games. The quiet was comforting. It felt like a reset button on the chaos of my life. I didn't venture into the unused rooms of the cabin, though. They creeped me out for no particular reason, and I kept their doors shut. It felt like their darkness might spill out if I left them open. On the 3rd day, the snow was heavier, and I decided to stay in. That's when things started feeling off. While outside with Rocky that afternoon, I noticed footprints in the snow around the cabin. They were fresh enough that the falling snow hadn't covered them entirely. They led from the edge of the woods toward the cabin and then away again, disappearing back into the trees. At first, I figured they belonged to someone staying at one of the nearby cabins, but I hadn't seen anyone. I felt uneasy but shook it off. It was probably just some hiker or hunter passing through. That night, as I settled into bed, Rocky started acting strangely. He perked up suddenly, ears alert, and then bolted downstairs. I listened as he paced back and forth in the living room, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor. Then he ran back upstairs, sat by the door, and whined to go outside. I grabbed his leash and followed him out. But instead of doing his business, he pulled me toward the trees, the same direction those footprints had gone earlier. He kept sniffing around the side of the cabin and then looked up toward the roof. I felt my stomach tighten. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. But something about the way Rocky stared into the woods made me want to get back inside as quickly as possible. Not long after we went back inside, I heard it, the sound of footsteps on the roof. At first, I thought it was just the snow shifting or maybe a branch falling. But the sound was rhythmic, like someone walking. 6 deliberate steps, then silence. I froze. Rocky's ears went up again, and he ran to the balcony door, staring out into the night. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight, threw on my coat, and stepped outside. The snow-covered roof looked untouched, and I saw nothing unusual in the trees. The silence out there was almost oppressive. I lit a cigarette to steady my nerves, telling myself it was probably an animal or the snow playing tricks on me. As I exhaled, my eyes adjusted to the dark, and I scanned the treetops. That's when I saw it. About 20 feet away, high up in one of the trees, something was crouched between 2 branches. My breath caught in my throat. It looked human, at least its shape did, but it was too tall, too thin. Its limbs were elongated, almost spider-like, and its pale skin stood out against the darkness. It crouched motionless, its long arms gripping the branch above it. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was featureless, but its mouth hung open in an expressionless gape. It couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow in the snow, or my imagination running wild. But Rocky's low growl behind me told me otherwise. I slowly backed into the cabin, never taking my eyes off the thing in the tree. Once inside, I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. I sat on the bed with Rocky, trying to calm myself, but the sound of light tapping on the balcony door sent my heart racing again. It was soft but deliberate, like someone lightly rapping their fingers against the glass. The tapping continued for what felt like an eternity, but I didn't dare move. Rocky, who had been so eager to bark earlier, now sat silently, staring at the door but refusing to approach it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there, clutching a knife I'd found in the kitchen, until the tapping finally stopped. When the first light of dawn broke, I packed my things as quickly as I could, loaded Rocky into the truck, and drove away. I didn't look back. A week later, I got a call from the realtor handling the sale of the cabin. He asked if I'd been staying there recently because the property manager reported signs of someone breaking in. Footprints in the snow, scratches on the balcony door, and a strange smell inside. I told him I hadn't noticed anything unusual and hung up. I didn't want to explain what I'd seen or what I thought I'd seen. To this day, I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just my imagination, fueled by stress and grief. Maybe there was a rational explanation for the noises, the footprints, and the figure in the tree. But every time I think about that night, I remember my dad's words. Fear the living because they can actually hurt you. And I wonder if, just maybe, it wasn't my imagination at all. Geraldine Larguet's story is one of survival, loss, and heartbreak. She was an experienced hiker who loved being in nature. In July 2013, Geraldine, known as Jerry to her friends and family, set out to hike the Appalachian Trail, a famous trail that stretches over 2,000 miles in the eastern United States. She was 66 years old and had been planning this adventure for a long time. Her husband, George, supported her and would meet her at certain points along the trail to provide supplies and check on her. As she traveled, Geraldine stayed in shelters and cabins built for hikers. These small, simple wooden shelters provide a place to rest and avoid bad weather. She was following the trail and had been doing well, even though she sometimes struggled with navigation. On July 22, 2013, she sent a text message to her husband saying she would meet him the next day at a planned spot. But Geraldine never arrived. What happened next is both sad and haunting. At some point that day, Geraldine left the main trail to go to the bathroom. She walked into the dense forest, expecting to find her way back easily. However, the thick woods of Maine can be confusing, and even experienced hikers can get lost. Geraldine couldn't find her way back to the trail. She tried to retrace her steps but ended up moving further away. She was now alone in the vast wilderness, far from help. For days, Geraldine wandered in search of the trail. She had a backpack with some supplies, but they were not enough for an extended time in the wilderness. She set up her tent in a clearing and hoped someone would find her. Search and rescue teams looked for her after she was reported missing, but the dense forest and rugged terrain made it difficult to locate her. Planes flew overhead, but the trees were so thick that she was hidden from view. Geraldine tried to survive with the little she had. She collected rainwater and rationed her food. She kept a journal to document her thoughts and experiences. In her notes, she wrote messages to her family and expressed her love for them. As time passed, her supplies ran out and she grew weaker. Despite her efforts to stay alive, the isolation and lack of resources were too much to overcome. 2 years later, in 2015, Geraldine's remains were found by a logging company worker. She was just 2,000 feet from the trail, a distance that seems small but can feel impossible in a dense forest. Near her remains, searchers found her tent, some of her belongings, and her journal. The entries in her journal revealed the pain and fear she felt but also showed her courage and love for her family. One of the most heartbreaking notes read, "When you find my body, please call my husband and daughter. It will be the greatest kindness for them to know." Geraldine's story touched many people. It highlights how even experienced hikers can face danger in the wild. The Appalachian Trail is beautiful, but it can also be unforgiving. It is a reminder of the importance of preparation, navigation skills, and staying on marked trails. Her family, while devastated by her loss, found some comfort in finally knowing what had happened to her. Geraldine's story is one of both tragedy and inspiration, showing the strength of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds.